History in print. Every story you're about to hear is real.
The water came in the afternoon. Not all at once. That was the cruelest part. It crept first across the low streets nearest the shore, ankle deep, then knee deep, then something else entirely. The wind had been building since morning. By dusk, it was no longer wind in any familiar sense. It was a force that pressed against wooden walls and found every gap. The island sat barely 8 feet above the Gulf of Mexico at its highest point. There was nowhere to climb, nowhere to run. The Gulf was coming up from the south. The bay was coming up from the north. And somewhere in the middle of that drowning island were 60,000 people who had gone to sleep the night before in the most prosperous city on the Texas coast. Good evening, this is History in Print. Tonight, Galveston, Texas, September 8th, 1900. Before the storm, Galveston was not a backwater. It was a destination. The city commanded the Gulf Coast the way New Orleans commanded the Mississippi. By geography, by commerce, by sheer accumulated wealth. Cotton moved through its port in vast quantities. Banks lined its avenues. Hotels received travelers from across the continent. Just days before the storm, a Beaumont newspaper described the Gulf Coast in terms almost reverent. Prairies, forests, marshes, and lakes stretching back from the shore. A vast and living landscape. The editors called it a grand American frontier. They were not wrong. But a frontier is also a place without shelter. The Gulf Coast between Texas and Florida offered no mountains, no natural barriers, no elevation of consequence. Galveston itself was a sandbar island, long, narrow, and flat. The city's leaders had discussed a seawall for years. It had not been built. On the evening of September 7th, 1900, the papers in Beaumont were running advertisements for French felt hats and farm equipment. The Weather Bureau had noted a tropical disturbance moving through the Gulf. No one used the word catastrophe. The morning of September 8th arrived already wrong. The barometric pressure was falling in a way that experienced observers recognized, but could not yet name aloud. Waves from the Gulf had been rolling higher since the night before, spilling over the low beach grade, pooling in the streets that ran nearest the shore. By mid-morning, those streets were underwater. The people of Galveston had seen tropical weather before. The Gulf Coast produced storms every season. Some residents moved to higher ground, though higher on Galveston Island meant perhaps a foot or two of additional elevation. Others stayed in their homes, watching from porches, judging the water by the bottom steps of their stairs. They were using the wrong measure. By early afternoon, the water was not measuring itself in steps. It was measuring itself in stories. The wind reached its full violence in the early evening hours. The record does not fix an exact moment when Galveston ceased to be a functioning city and became something else, a field of wreckage on an inundated island. But the transition was fast. Witnesses would later describe walls of water moving through the streets, not waves in any coastal sense, but solid moving bodies of the Gulf itself, carrying lumber, rooftops, horses, and human beings together in the same dark current. The houses of Galveston were built of wood, as most American cities of that era were built. Wood floats. That fact saved some lives and ended others. Structures torn from their foundations became battering rams. They moved with the surge and struck whatever remained standing. A family that had climbed to a second floor could survive the water and be killed by the house next door arriving through the wall. The Gulf Coast editorial, published just 2 days before the storm, had celebrated this shoreline as a living landscape. Marshes, prairies, the long, low banks curving from the Texas border eastward. On the night of September 8th, the distinction between land and gulf had largely ceased to exist on Galveston Island. The water was everywhere the island was. Among the 60,000 residents caught in that storm were men and women of every station the city supported. Cotton merchants, dock workers, hotel keepers, school teachers, the families of fishermen, the clerks who had been reading advertisements for French felt hats and butterick patterns just the day before. The record does not permit us to follow each of them. What the record shows is the aggregate of what the storm demanded. It demanded enormously. Buildings that had stood for decades came down in hours. The beach grade, the modest elevation that separated the Gulf-facing shore from the city streets, was overtopped so completely that it ceased to function as any kind of barrier. Storm surge estimates would later range between 8 and 15 feet above the island's normal grade. For a city whose highest natural point was 8 feet above sea level, that arithmetic was fatal. The water did not just flood Galveston, it covered it. By the time the winds began to ease, sometime in the early hours of September 9th, the island was unrecognizable. Where rows of Victorian homes had stood, there were open lots strewn with debris compressed into great windrows by the retreating surge. Where the beach grade had defined the city's southern edge, there was now a rubble ridge, the compressed remains of everything the storm had consumed and deposited as it withdrew. It was reported that this debris line stretched for miles along the island's Gulf shore. The city that had gone to sleep on the night of September 7th, reading about Supreme Court politics and coffee market anxieties, woke on September 9th to something that had no name yet in the American experience.
Every word you just heard came from the original newspapers. Subscribe to History in Print, a new story from the American